I love that in the Message, Dr. Peterson's version, he calls him a religion scholar. So a religion scholar, or in other versions, the lawyer, walks up to Jesus and asks the question that we might expect to hear from a young child, but perhaps not from an adult. Who is my neighbor? Now, I kind of wonder who would ask such a thing unless they're trying to wiggle their way out of something. Many of you are familiar with the work of Amy Jill Levine, New Testament and Jewish Studies professor from Vanderbilt University. Dr. Levine explains that the lawyer's question is misguided. She writes that to ask, "Who is my neighbor?" is a polite way of asking, "Who is not my neighbor?" Or, "Who does not deserve my love?" Or, "Whose lack of food or shelter can I ignore?" Or, "Whom can I hate?" The answer Jesus gives is no one. Everyone deserves that love. Local or alien, Jews or Gentile, terrorist or rapist, everyone. Now, some of us might balk at that. After all, we all have our own personal boundaries that we've established for our lives. Most of us start building our walls, designing our comfort zones from the time we're tiny. We know who fits in our own little worlds and who doesn't. We know whom we will accept help from, whom we will help, and just who needs to be far, far away from us so that we will feel safe and secure and all might be right in our world. And then Jesus comes bursting in and has different ideas. And he challenges us to break down our barriers and move beyond our well-designed walls and step out of those comfort zones and follow him into a complicated world of grace and compassion. And even though I might think I'm pretty full of grace and compassion, he always makes me take that one step more. Now, like most people, I was greatly formed by the times in which I grew up. If you can think back to the 60s and 70s, or for you younger folks, think about movies or something you might have seen about that time frame. Think love beads and bell bottoms and Vietnam and civil rights marches and gay rights marches and women's rights marches. You'll be able to understand why I, like many people my age, came out of that time with a bit of conflict in my head and my heart. The values of my fairly traditional conservative parents did not necessarily fit in my head. And my folks, one of whom was a Navy dad who, after 8 years aboard a ship and then a career in the criminal justice system, ended up with a wannabe hippie daughter, didn't quite know what to do with me. Now, here's an odd thing that happened in my wee little brain. Remember how I mentioned that it was an era of gay rights marches? In the midst of all our arguing about every little thing, and I mean butting heads, that Navy dad of mine, who I thought was the most chauvinistic, antiquated thing since the Stone Age, had a thing or two to teach me about hospitality and inclusivity. Somehow, even though I thought I was a progressively minded, bleeding heart, march in the streets liberal, a message from greater society had permeated my brain and my soul. A message that was dark and hateful. A message that said not all people are loved by God, or welcome in church, or that they even had much worth in society. My church did not teach me that. that dark, soul-sucking message. My parents did not teach me that message. Nevertheless, my brain got the message, and I believed it deep into the core of my being. And then, when I was 15 years old, our family met Ted and George. Ted was this tall, handsome, erudite man. He was the principal of a local school. And okay, my 15-year-old self had a wee bit of a crush on him. Ted's housemate, George, was more rugged and a bit more unkempt. They almost seemed like an Oscar and Felix combo, but they got along well, and they were really fun to be around. They were both kind and generous with their time and their home, and as we all got to know one another, we became close, frequently sharing time and meals together. At one point, Ted and George invited me to attend a demolition derby with them in Red Lodge, Montana, which was about 60 miles away from our home in Billings. I was really surprised when my overprotective, rarely say yes parents agreed. But this proved that their level of trust in these men was high. I don't know when I finally realized that Ted and George were more than just housemates. Of course, it took me decades before I realized that Oscar and Felix, at least the original Oscar and Felix, were more than just housemates. But it was at that point when I realized, or actually I think it was my parents who told me about Ted and George, as my gaydar was not too keen. But at that moment, a little kernel of surprise and change began to grow in my mind and my soul. Was it at all possible that this gay rights movement that was blooming out there in New York City and San Francisco and other faraway exotic places had some merit? Ted and George were our friends. They were welcome in our home. They were entrusted with my care. They were our neighbors. And they were certainly deserving of our friendship, our companionship, our food, our shelter. American writer Astrid Alada has said, "You must weed your mind as you would weed your garden." We develop or grow many thoughts as we grow and develop throughout our lives. If we were to keep all those initial thoughts intact without ever taking them out, taking a closer look at them, challenging them now and again, growth would be impossible. I suspect that grace would be difficult, if not impossible. If we fill our minds solely with our own thoughts and ideas, we leave too little room for God. And that can be a risky proposition. Not that God is incapable of working through our thoughts, or that ability to think is not given to us as a part of the God-given package, but we do have that free will thing going for us, and we can shut down our awareness of divine inspiration and the movement of God's Spirit in our lives all too easily. Now, I don't want to give you the impression that I completely changed my way of thinking about life and gay rights and suddenly started marching with my LGBTQ neighbors. Yeah, that didn't happen. But both of my fathers are gone now, so I can finally admit that I'm a bit stubborn, wherever my donkey is. I am a bit opinionated, and it was not an overnight evolution for me. It took a lot of years, some truly life-changing experiences, and the influence of some amazing people whose kind, loving words and ways opened my eyes and my heart. William E. Lewis Jr., a radio personality from Florida, has said, "It's perfectly okay to make a decision and then change your mind. Being able to change your mind is the best way to find out you still have one. All these years later, I'm still learning and growing and changing my mind about things. Hence, the Free Mom Hugs t-shirt. So I guess it's all a good sign. The lawyer who approached Jesus had his mind filled with his own thoughts. He was surrounded with the barriers and carefully constructed walls that he had built. That they were built with the experiences and the influences of the society in which he lived. Jesus understood all that. And so he needed to tell a story that would cause the man to take a step back, to do some deep introspection, some weeding of that tangled garden in his own mind. It may seem odd that this lawyer is asking, "Who is my neighbor?" But as Dr. Levine explains, it's actually a good question of legalities. After all, Canadians are our neighbors, but they may have different rights and responsibilities than we do. The point is, Jesus isn't concerned with the minutia of legalities. He's concerned about love. As he knows, Jewish law not only says you shall love your neighbor as yourself, but that you shall love the stranger who dwells among you, because you were strangers who dwelled in the land of Egypt. Luke doesn't tell us if the lawyer changed his mind that day, or the next, or 15 years later. We only know that Jesus told him this story of the man who was beaten and robbed and thrown in a ditch, and then helped by someone he considered his enemy. And then Jesus told him to go and do likewise. Because being a neighbor isn't about what society tells us or what the courts tell us. Being a neighbor is about what God tells us, and that is about loving one another and caring for those in need. Amen.